Okay, so this is part 2 of the classification unit. So we talked about the characteristics of life in part 1 and some of the other kingdoms. So there are 6 kingdoms of life. However, these days we often talk about domains of life. Domains are a larger classification than kingdoms. Domains show 3 main evolutionary branches. The first evolutionary branch is the true bacteria. This contains the kingdom eubacteria. These are bacteria that we normally think of as, well, the bacteria we're familiar with. We can grow them in petri dishes. They're the ones that make us sick. When we use hand sanitizer, these are the bacteria we're trying to get off of our hands. Okay, the archaebacteria are more the wild bacteria. Okay, this is another domain, is the archaebacteria. They're a whole different evolutionary branch. These are the ancient bacteria. We can't grow them in the lab. They seem to grow in very extreme environments as well as environments that are not extreme. They do seem to be everywhere. And then the third evolutionary branch of life, or the third domain, is the eukaryota. And as this name looks like, this looks like eukaryotes. And that's exactly what it has. It has all the eukaryotes, or all of the living things that have cells with nuclei. So that would include the fungi, the animals, the plants, and all these other funky looking things. These are all included in the kingdom Protoctista, which has a lot of the protists. Okay, so these are the 3 main domains. So looking at an example, let's say the species of humans, us, Homo sapiens, we are in the kingdom Animalia. If I didn't write the domain here, but the domain would be eukaryota. That would be the larger umbrella. Okay, and under animals, we are animals with backbones. So we're in the phylum Chordata. We're mammals. We have fur and mammary glands. So we're Mammalia. That's the class. Order comes under that. We're primates. We're in the family Hominidae. Those are the apes, the ape branch of the primate tree. And we're genus Homo and species Sapiens. We are the only species in this genus, but on the planet there have been many other species of Homo, but right now we're the only ones. Okay, so here's just a little cartoon that shows, okay, kingdom, this is just divided into animals and plants, but this shows the 9 major phyla. Now you're going to have to be responsible to know characteristics of these 9 major phyla, and hopefully you're doing a project like your flashcards or something like that. But we have the periphery. The periphery are going to be the sponges. They do not show specialization into different tissues. All of the cells kind of look like a protist, like a colony of protists all put together. They filter water. They're found only in the ocean. Cnidaria, these would include the jellyfish and the corals, the anemones. These, a characteristic of Cnidaria is they have stinging cells, or nematocysts, and they do have tissues. Platyhelminthes are the flatworms, a hard name to say, but Planaria, which hopefully you've seen in class, would be an example of Platyhelminthes. Nematodes, they live in soil. They're very, very small. They're usually less than a millimeter. Very small worms. There are lots of them in soil. We do have some on our bodies also, believe it or not. Mollusks, oh, the other worm here is Annelida. Earthworms, these are segmented worms. These can be large. Leeches are also annelids. Mollusks, these are animals that usually can make a shell, but not always. Think about the squids and the slugs. Arthropoda, this is the largest phylum in the animals. This is going to include all of your crustaceans and your insects. They all have exoskeletons and they have segmented limbs. That's what this word means. Jointed feet, arthropoda. Echinoderms, this means spiny skin. And this is going to include the starfish and sea urchins. They often have a radial symmetry, not a bilateral symmetry, meaning that there are many planes of symmetry. And chordates, these are animals with backbones. Okay. Okay. Okay, why classify? You can think of lots of reasons to classify, I'm sure. But one of the main ones is, organization. Some of you probably have collections at home. Maybe it's Beanie Babies or baseball cards or, I don't know, Jonas Brothers songs. Your songs may be organized on your iPod, but if you have a collection, often it's just easier to find stuff if it's organized. Okay, that's number one. Number two, though, also communication. If we're going to talk about a particular species of beetle and everybody's using a different classification system, we're not going to know very much about that beetle because everybody is going to be talking about something different. And another big reason is that classification reflects something about the system, whether you're doing Beanie Babies or whatever. But our classification system reflects some knowledge about species as we know it. And what it tells us is it tells us the evolutionary history. It tells us something about the evolution of these species. Okay, our classification tree is based on not just random relationships between species, but it's based on how they're related. So just like a family tree tells you something about the relationship between people. So for instance, these two people here, these would be brother and sister. Okay, whereas this person, they are related to this person up here, but they're not super closely related. This looks like there's a lot of people separating this person and this person on the family tree. Just like in an evolutionary tree, if we look at this organism here, this is Archaebacteria. Archaebacteria and dogs, which are vertebrates, they're related. They're all part of the same evolutionary tree, but there's a lot of history and there's a lot of species that are separating Archaebacteria and vertebrates, for instance, dogs. Okay, but if we look at dogs, which are vertebrates, and these funny looking things right here, these are sea squirts that live in the ocean. Believe it or not, vertebrates and these sea squirts, these are closely related. Okay, sea squirts have a very primitive backbone. Likewise, angiosperms, flowering plants, and pine trees, they're a lot more related. They shared a common ancestor not too long in the past versus, say, pine trees and algae. Brown algae in the ocean, well, they're related, but they shared an ancestor way back here on the evolutionary tree a long time ago. Okay? So our classification system that we use reflects these evolutionary relationships. Okay, so there's some main people who gave us the classification system that we use today. The first is Aristotle. He lived in Greece. He lived a long time ago. And Aristotle said that, well, we can have these sort of major groupings of animals, and he put them on a chain. So he put humans way up here on the top of the chain, and as you can see, man, he's way up top. And then this is a monkey, I believe, with a tail. Monkeys are right below man, as are lions. So things that are sort of big and imposing are way up on the top of the chain, and then things that live in the ocean, corals, sea fans, they're way down here. Insects are way down here. So he had sort of this whole chain of being. But he was the first to classify vertebrates and invertebrates, and that's a classification we still use today. Okay, and then in more recent history, believe it or not, a botanist started a whole classification system that was used for a while. He used Latin. He was the first to use Latin for naming, and he defined a species, and it's the same definition that we also use for a species, but his names were very, very long in Latin. They were too cumbersome. Very few people could learn them. So Linnaeus also used Latin, and he classified species according to their structure, and he used a very simple naming system, a binomial naming system, meaning two names. Whoops. Linnaeus also used Latin, and he classified organisms by their structure. The naming system that he developed is one that's still used today, and that's where we have two names for a species, the genus and the species name, Since it's two names, we say it's bi, meaning two. Binomial, nomial meaning name. Binomial nomenclature is the technical word we use for the classification system that we use today. And this system was developed by Linnaeus over 300 years ago. And you'll often see his name, or the capital letter L, used after a species name, meaning that it is a name that Linnaeus gave the species. Okay. Alright, that was his. Okay, another thing that we learned in this unit is how to use a microscope. You should have had some practice. And you have to use the smallest objective. We call that the scanning objective. You move that into place. Your slide will be on the stage. You can use the clips to hold your slide down. You look through the eyepiece, and you're going to move the slide until you see something under the scanning objective. You'll use the coarse focusing knob, the big knob, to focus. You'll do almost all your focusing under the scanning objective. And then to get a really clear picture, you can use the fine focus knob, but that's only going to work after you use the coarse focusing knob. There's very little focusing done with the small knob. Okay? And then you can go up to a higher power, so we have low power after scanning and then high power after low power. Okay, and it's very important to only use the fine focus knob when you're on either low or high. Otherwise, you're going to break the slide because the coarse knob moves the objective way too much. Okay, so this is something that I should have talked about a little bit earlier about the definition of species. We've been saying species a lot in this unit. How do you know whether two organisms are the same species or not? Well, one thing you may think about is whether they look alike. Okay, but that can be deceiving if you think about the larvae of an insect versus, say, the larvae of a caterpillar, of a butterfly. So you think of a caterpillar and a butterfly. They look very, very different, but it's the same species. Same with birds. Sometimes the male bird, like a peacock, is a lot more colorful than the female bird. So the definition of a species is really not so much how it looks, but the definition of a species are whether or not two organisms are able to interbreed. Okay, so that's whether they're able to mate and they're able to make kids or offspring that are also able to interbreed. Okay, so they're able to make fertile offspring or kids. Offspring is the technical word for kids in biology. Okay. Alright, so this is important because if we think about donkeys and horses making mules, mules are sterile. They usually don't make more mules. There are exceptions to that. But sometimes we do have different species, lions and tigers making ligers, but ligers are not fertile. And in fact, a lot of lions and tigers die. People trying to force them to make offspring because their parts, the babies, don't really work in tigers. Ligers would be way too big for a tiger mom, and a tiger would die when giving birth to it. And if we think about species, you may not realize, but mammals, let's see, here we are, well, chordates. Actually, these are not chordates, mammals. This picture represents the number of species per grouping. I'm not sure if it's phylum or class in here. But if you can see, the number of mammals is going to be much smaller than, say, the number of insects. Okay, most of the species that we think about on the planet are, well, they're bacteria, but if we're not talking about bacteria, then believe it or not, they are insects. Okay. You should know the difference between phylogenetic trees and cladograms, but basically phylogenetic trees are evolutionary trees that show relationships. Okay, and they're going to have some sort of time scale. Here's a time scale up here. So they're going to give you an estimated amount of time that two species shared a common ancestor. So the dog and the wolf shared a common ancestor about 2 million years in the past versus a black bear and a gray wolf which shared a common ancestor